So to go to the moon, the United States built the Saturn V rocket, still the largest rocket ever built, the Saturn V. At launch, the Saturn V used more fuel in 1/10 of a second than Lindbergh used on his entire flight across from New York to Paris. So it's a big rocket. And to go to the moon would take 2 spacecraft. On the left is the command module and service module, which would carry 3 astronauts. On the right is the lunar lander, which would descend from lunar orbit to take 2 astronauts down to the surface of the moon. This is how the lunar lander was stored aboard the Saturn V rocket. It was stored folded up right behind the command module. Once they were in space, the command module would turn around and dock. This is why docking was important, with the lunar lander, and this is the configuration that they were in when they flew to the moon. Now, the lunar lander is a 2-stage vehicle. The bottom stage is the descent vehicle, and the upper stage is the ascent vehicle. Once they were in lunar orbit, the lunar lander would separate from the command module. The command module would stay in orbit around the moon, and the lunar lander would descend to the surface. So 2 astronauts climbed in July of 1969, climbed into the lunar lander. Neil Armstrong was the commander, Buzz Aldrin was the pilot of the lander, and they started descending to the surface of the moon. First time ever people were going to land on the moon. Well, as they landed, they got a computer error message. It was called a 1202 alarm. 1202 alarm had never came up in any of their training. And they go, what does 1202 alarm mean? And the people on the ground said, what does a 1202 alarm mean? And they started going through their books and stuff to figure out what's going on. What it meant was the computer was saying, you're asking me to do too much. I can't do all the things you're asking me to do. So that was what the alarm meant. So when NASA saw that, they said, heck with it, keep pushing on. The 1202 alarm came on another 5 times. But they decided that they were going to continue with their attempt. Ignore the alarm, we're going to keep going down. Well, as they got closer to the lunar surface, it was the computer that was flying the spacecraft. And Neil and Buzz realized that they were about to land in a field of boulders. A field of boulders as big as houses. So they said, we're taking over. They took over from the computer. Neil Armstrong started flying the lunar lander, and he started flying horizontally along the surface of the moon. But the problem now was they were running out of fuel. And NASA called up and said, by the way, you only have 60 seconds of fuel left. And they still hadn't found a place to land. They kept flying a little bit further. NASA called out 30 seconds. They still hadn't found a place to land. Finally, Neil said, that place looks pretty good, and he set it down. Now you'll notice on the landing legs is this gold foil at the bottom. Behind that gold foil is a large piston or shock absorber. The NASA engineers had designed it so when the lunar lander landed on the moon, those shock absorbers or pistons would compress and absorb some of the impact. Neil Armstrong did such a good job of landing on the moon that these did not compress. He just set it down so gently, they didn't compress. So they made it to the moon. Neil Armstrong came out. The first thing he did is he pulled this little handle right there, which extended this TV camera, so we could have photographs of the first person walking on the moon. Remember I was saying that the computer was having problems, it couldn't do all that? This is 1969. The computer in this spaceship is about 32,000 times slower than just the clock in your smartphone. We've kind of evolved in our computer technology. But some people say that's not a very fair comparison. It would be like comparing the Wright Flyer to an F-18 Super Hornet. They both fly, but that's about it. You know, they're not the same class. So Neil comes down the ladder. We've got these grainy TV photographs of him coming down the ladder. The very first thing he had to do, because those landing shock absorbers didn't compress, you see how far the bottom rung is from the pad? It's over 3 feet, it's about a meter. And he didn't know, if I get down to the pad, am I going to be able to get back up the ladder to get back in the spaceship? So the very first thing he had to do was to see if he could get from the pad to the bottom rung of the ladder. Well, luckily the moon has 1/6 the Earth's gravity. So a 180-pound person on Earth only weighs 30 pounds on the moon. So he was very easy able to make that jump to get up the ladder. Once he knew he could make that jump back up the ladder, he stepped off the pad and he said, that's one small step for a man, that's one giant leap for mankind. Became the first person to step foot on the moon. Again, all we have is these grainy TV photographs of Neil Armstrong stepping on the moon. Where was Neil Armstrong from? Wapakoneta, Ohio. Okay, folks, let's review. Who invented the airplane? Wright brothers. Where were they from? Ohio. Who was the first American to orbit the Earth? John Glenn. Where was he from? Ohio. Who was the first person to walk on the moon? Neil Armstrong. Where was he from? Ohio. Guess where I'm from? How'd you guess? That's amazing. Yeah. So, he stepped off onto the moon, becoming the first person on the moon. Now, to save weight, they only took up one still camera, and Neil had the still camera. So who was the second person to walk on the moon? Buzz Aldrin. Buzz Aldrin once gave a speech here at this museum where he said, "My name is Buzz Aldrin, the second man to walk on the moon. Neil before me." I thought it was okay. Corny, but it was okay. So even though we had the grainy television photographs of Neil, we have nice, clear, still photographs of Buzz Aldrin coming down the ladder, the second man on the moon. You'll notice on the hatch, there's no handles on the outside of the hatch. The NASA engineers kind of forgot about that. So the first thing that Buzz had to do was wedge the door open so the door wouldn't close when they were on the moon. He came down the ladder, and he stepped onto the surface of the moon, becoming the second person on the moon. Neil, since he had the still camera, he took this very famous photograph of Buzz. Man on the moon. Again, one of the most famous photographs in history. For a long time, we thought this is the only still photograph we have of Neil Armstrong on the moon. Because if you blow up the visor, his gold-plated visor, you can see Neil Armstrong taking Buzz's picture. So we thought this is the only still photograph we have of Neil Armstrong on the moon. It was the first lunar selfie. So they were on the moon for several hours, and then just before they left, Neil handed the camera to Buzz to take some panoramic shots of the moon. And a few years ago, there was a young researcher doing a project over at NASA headquarters, which is a couple blocks from here. And he was going through some old photographs when he discovered that inadvertently Buzz Aldrin had captured a photograph of Neil Armstrong loading some equipment into the lunar lander. So we finally had another still photograph of Neil Armstrong on the moon. Here's Neil after his moonwalk. He looks pretty happy. Here's Buzz. And for extra points, who was the third astronaut who stayed in orbit around the moon in the command module? Michael Collins. Michael Collins was the third member of the Apollo 11 crew. Very important job. Neil and Buzz were not coming home without Michael Collins. So they're glad he was there. After Michael Collins left NASA, he became the first executive director of this museum right here in 1976. So that's kind of cool. So the bottom part stayed on the moon rather. The upper part would blast off to carry the two astronauts back into space. The lower portion would stay on the moon. The upper portion would fly up to lunar orbit to rendezvous with the command module. They would dock, The astronauts would transfer their moon rock and moon dust samples into the command module. The 2 astronauts would get in, and then they would eject the ascent vehicle, and it would crash into the surface of the moon. So the lunar landers that went to the moon are still on the moon. The one behind me here is a real spaceship. Its mission was canceled, but this is exactly what the astronauts took to the moon. It looks like some kid's science project. A lot of people ask about the crinkled up foil. That's insulation. There's 27 layers of that foil. If they laid the foil flat on top of each other, the heat would pass right through. So by crinkling it up, it increased the resistance and made the insulation much more effective.
Also, who took the picture of the bottom part when
I'm sorry?
Who took the picture of the
Who took the picture? Very good question. Not the Apollo 11 astronauts. On later missions, they took up a lunar rover. It was basically a car on the moon that had a camera mounted to it. So when the astronauts were leaving, the engineers on the Earth could use the camera to film the departure. So that's not the Apollo 11 departure photographs. Those are from a different mission. Good question. So it took them 4 days to get to the moon. They were on the moon for about a day, and it took them 4 days to get back. When they splashed down, only part of the Saturn V rocket to return was the command module. This is the only part of the Saturn V stack that made it back to Earth. For the last 42 years, you would have seen this command module of the Apollo 11 Columbia module right here in the middle of this hall. But to celebrate the 50th anniversary of the moon landings, it's currently on a tour of the nation. Right now, it's in Seattle, Washington. It's not due to come back to our museum until 2022. 4 days to get there, 4 days to get back. They landed in the Pacific near Hawaii. They had definitely been out of the country. It is the federal government. This is the customs form they made them fill out. Not alive. In response to the question, what's your cargo? They put down moon rock and moon dust samples. In response to the question, are there any conditions on board which may lead to the spread of disease? They put down to be determined. They did not know if there were germs on the moon, because when they landed, they stayed in a modified Airstream camper. They had to be in quarantine for 21 days to make sure that there were no germs on the moon that they would bring back to Earth. So here are the 3 astronauts in their camper, separated from the rest of us. There were no germs. Later missions to the moon, they did not have to do that quarantine. Anybody have any questions about anything we talked about so far?
Is it any different? The samples are any different from what we found?
Are the samples any different? Different from what?
Yeah, from what we find in our...
Oh, absolutely. The oldest rock here on Earth is about 3.4 billion years old. The moon rock, which unfortunately is not on display right now, is 3.8 billion years old. In fact, it was because of the moon rocks that the astronauts brought back, we didn't know how the moon formed or why the Earth had such a big moon. And thanks to the astronauts, we now know that billions of years ago, the Earth collided with another planet about the size of Mars. And after that collision, all this rock got thrown into space. We called that rocket, that planet Theia, because in mythology, Theia is the mother of the moon. And for a while, the Earth had a ring of rocks, just like Saturn. Gravity brought all those together to form our moon. And our moon is currently receding away from us. It's pulling away at the rate of 1.5 inches every year. So if we're going to go back to the moon, we better get going, because it keeps getting further away. Now, the moon rock, I said, was 3.8 billion years old, older than any rock on Earth. I have a rock from outer space. This rock from outer space is 4.5 billion years old. This is the oldest thing you'll ever touch. This is a piece of an asteroid. It formed at the same time as our sun, the planets, the comets, the asteroids. It formed out of that big ball of dust and gas that collapsed to make our solar system. So pass it around. What do you notice about it?
It's heavy.
It's heavy. It's mostly iron. It's mostly iron. We've all seen shooting stars, right? Shooting stars are not stars. We call them meteors. They're tiny bits of dust and rock. When they enter the Earth's atmosphere, the friction with the Earth's atmosphere causes them to burn up, and we see that flash of light in the sky. In the sky, we call them meteors. If that piece of rock is big enough and makes it all the way down to the ground, then we call it a meteorite. That's a meteorite. It used to be part of an asteroid. It landed in Russia in 1947. So pass that around. That's the oldest thing you'll ever touch. If the moon rock was here at 3.8, that would be the second oldest thing you ever touch. And if you touch me, I'll be the third oldest thing you ever touch. No takers? A lot of times people will bring rocks that they find into the museum thinking they found a meteorite, but we have to tell them it's a meteor rock. It's a little museum humor.
What was the age on that?
4.5 billion. To be exact, it's 4.567. Easy number to remember.
5 6.
Yeah.
So if it protected them from radiation, they had to go through the radiation belt.
Yeah, exactly. No, they were exposed. Just like our astronauts are today in the International Space Station. No, for sometimes during solar flares, there is a special room aboard the International Space Station that the astronauts go inside to protect them from solar flares. That's one of the things, by the way, we're concerned about radiation exposure on going to Mars, because it's going to be such a long trip to get to Mars, about the levels of radiation exposure that the people will experience.
Do you have any radiation-related diseases after that?
Well, very interesting. There was an astronaut by the name of Scott Kelly, and he spent a year in space. Mark Kelly spent a year in space. His brother Scott was also an astronaut, but they're identical twins. So it gave NASA an opportunity to compare how identical bioforms would react to after a year in space, and they have found differences in Mark. His genetics have changed from being in space for a year, which is kind of everybody scratching their head going, wow, this is wild. If we could keep that meteorite moving around, keeping an eye on it. That's my 4.5 billion year old rock. I don't want to lose it. Anybody else have a question?
So, how do you date it? Is it using radioactivity?
The question was asked, how do you date a 4.5 billion year old rock? Well, you've all heard of radiocarbon dating, that we used to determine the life of things that used to be alive. Same thing applies to heavier elements. The half-life of uranium is billions of years. And by measuring the amount of those heavier elements, we can determine that our solar system is 3.5 billion years old. Rounded off to the closest hundredth million. Anyone else?
How did you come into contact with that rock?
I am a space nerd, and I used to work at a museum in Cleveland called the Cleveland Natural History Museum. The director of the gift shop there knew that I was into meteorites, and so when a good sample would come in, she'd give me a heads up before she put it on display to see if I wanted to buy it, and that's when I bought that one. So, $90. Last time I looked online, it's about $180 today, so I've doubled my money, but it's not for sale. Moon rocks are extremely rare. It's against the law for a private individual to own a moon rock. Meteorites are not rare. NASA estimates that over 40 tons of debris fall from space on Earth every day. So you can find meteorites anywhere. A lot of times they're found in the desert, or they're found in Antarctica because the black rock shows up nice against the snow and ice, or the white sand. If you next time you clean your gutters on your house, take a magnet and run it down the gutter, all the little particles that your magnet picks up are probably meteorite tracings that fell from space. Yes? Yes! Oh my goodness! Wait a minute. Yes, there was a woman in Georgia, and this was back in the 50s. She was on her couch, and a piece of rock came through the ceiling and hit her on the thigh. That rock, that meteorite, is in the Smithsonian Natural History Museum. I have to add that photograph to my talk. Thank you very much. But yes, so that's the only known person that we know of having been hit by a meteorite. She did not die, but that's the only known hit. There could have been somebody who got hit and didn't tell us about it. Yes, sir.
See the remnants of the
Yes, there's a satellites in orbit around the moon right now called the Lunar Reconnaissance Orbiter, and if you go online, you can see photographs that the Lunar Reconnaissance Orbiter have taken of all the Apollo landing spots. For Apollo 11, you can see the astronauts' footprints in the moon dust. For later missions, you can see the tracks that their cars made when they were driving around the moon. But yes, you can see the landing spots. And one of the jobs of the Lunar Reconnaissance Orbiter is looking for landing spots for the next time we go to the moon. We shall see. Anybody else? Where's my moon rocket? Oh, my space rock. Thank you. Well, one more stop. Let's walk over to the space race gallery.